This video is sponsored by War Thunder.
Speedbird 38, clear line 27 left, wind 210 knots.
Clear line 27 left, Speedbird 38.
Flying over London, a British Airways Boeing 777 is on final approach. In just a few minutes, the aircraft should be safely on the ground. As the first officer takes control to execute the landing, he suddenly notices a drop in airspeed. The aircraft's automation increases engine power, but the speed keeps falling. Then comes a chilling realization: neither engine is responding. The aircraft begins to sink toward the ground. The pilots don't have time to diagnose the problem. They need to act quickly, or risk crashing into one of London's densely populated suburbs. Can the crew glide the aircraft safely to the runway, or is disaster unavoidable? This is the story of British Airways Flight 38.
Mayday, Mayday, Speedbird, 95.
The story of British Airways Flight 38 began in Beijing, China, on January 17, 2008. Operated by a Boeing 777, Flight 38 was the return leg to London of the regularly scheduled flight between the two countries. The aircraft had touched down in Beijing hours earlier and was being serviced in preparation for the journey to London. In command of Flight 38 was 43-year-old Captain Peter Burkill, a seasoned pilot with 12,700 hours of total flight time and 8,500 hours on the Boeing 777. His senior first officer, 41-year-old John Coward, had a total of 9,000 hours of flight time and 7,000 hours on the 777. First Officer Connor McGuinness, a 35-year-old pilot with 5,000 hours of total flight time and 1,100 hours on the 777, would serve as the relief pilot. He would replace Captain Burkill and First Officer Coward in turn, allowing them to leave the flight deck and get a few hours of rest during the cruise portion of the flight. All pilots had arrived in Beijing several days prior and had spent almost 2 days off duty before operating Flight 38. The planned route of flight would take the 777 over the northern parts of China, then continue northeast across a large part of Russia before reaching Europe and culminating in the United Kingdom. According to the flight plan, the aircraft would climb to an initial altitude of 34,100 feet before descending to 31,500 feet over the China-Mongolia border due to extremely low air temperatures that were forecast en route. Unbeknownst to anyone on board, the expected drop in outside air temperature would play a major role in the story of British Airways Flight 38. At 10:09 Beijing time, carrying 136 passengers and 79,000 kilograms of fuel on board, the Boeing 777 took off and, turning northeast, began climbing away from Beijing. Shortly after, air traffic control requested the crew to climb to an initial cruise altitude of 34,800 feet. Although this was slightly higher than the originally planned altitude for the first portion of the flight, the crew accepted the request. Flying at higher altitudes in extremely cold conditions can have subtle but serious effects on the aircraft, especially on systems like the fuel supply. Considering a higher-than-planned cruising altitude and the cold conditions expected en route, the pilots made a decision to closely monitor the fuel temperature, ensuring that it does not drop below the allowed limits. As the aircraft continued its journey over Russia and northern Europe, burning off fuel, it became significantly lighter. The lower weight allowed the crew to select a higher cruise altitude for more optimized flight performance. This practice, called a step climb, is standard on longer flights. Passing by Moscow, Russia, the flight crew engaged the vertical speed mode to command a shallow climb to an altitude of 38,000 feet. A few hours later, overflying Sweden, the aircraft climbed further up to 40,000 feet. By using the VS mode, the pilots could avoid high pitch angles and abrupt changes in engine power, providing a more comfortable experience to the passengers. As we will discuss further, this seemingly positive choice contributed significantly to the fate of Flight 38. A big thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game out there, and you can play it for free right now on PC, consoles, and mobile. Take control of more than 2,500 vehicles, from tanks and helicopters to fighter jets and warships across 10 different nations. From early biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. The combat feels intense and immersive thanks to incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic visuals and sound, and a damage system that goes far beyond basic health bars. With over 70 million players worldwide, you'll never be short on action. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there's simply no game better suited for fans of military history. What I personally like is the variety in how you can play. Arcade mode keeps things fast and fun, while simulator mode cranks up the realism. And now, with the new mobile version on iOS and Android, you can take the fight with you wherever you go. Play War Thunder for free today. The game is available on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile. Make sure to sign up using the link in the pinned comment or video description. If you're a new player or a returning player who hasn't logged in for at least 6 months on PC or console, you'll get access to a massive bonus pack including multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 Silver Lions, 7 days of premium account, and the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor. This bonus is available for a limited time only, so don't miss your chance. The cruise portion of the flight continued as planned, and approximately 40 minutes prior to landing, the flight crew initiated the descent. As the aircraft approached London, air traffic control instructed Flight 38 to enter the Lambourne holding just northeast of London at 11,000 feet. The airplane spent approximately 5 minutes in the holding pattern, and after descending to 9,000 feet in the hold, was cleared for an ILS approach to runway 27 left. Having pre-programmed the aircraft's automation, the crew instructed the autopilot to intercept the ILS signal, line up with the runway, and begin descending on the glide slope. Passing through a layer of clouds at 3,000 feet, the pilots saw the airport straight ahead and in clear view. They were only a few minutes away from completing the long journey from Asia, and the approach continued without issue until the aircraft descended through the last 1,000 feet of altitude.
1,000.
At 1,000 feet above the ground, with the landing gear in the down position and the wing flaps extended to 30 degrees, the 777 was fully configured for the approach. Although the captain was the pilot flying for the initial approach, he would hand over control to the first officer in a few moments per the company procedures. The autopilot was still engaged at this time, but, as briefed by the crew earlier in the flight, the first officer would complete the landing manually, planning to disconnect the autopilot at around 600 feet above the ground. Throughout the aircraft's descent on the glide slope, the autothrottle maintained the desired approach speed of 135 knots by slightly moving the thrust levers and thus adjusting the power. At 720 feet, the right engine began to gradually spool down. Sensing the drop in thrust, the autothrottle advanced the left thrust lever to compensate, but the engine did not respond. As the aircraft descended another 100 feet, the left engine also began losing thrust. Just a minute from touchdown, the 160-ton airliner had lost nearly all available power, yet it was still miles from the runway. To avoid overstressing the engines, the autothrottle limited the movement of the thrust levers, splitting them. The resulting stagger, with the left thrust lever further ahead than the right, caught the attention of the first officer. Focusing on the engines, he did not disconnect the autopilot at 600 feet as intended. The autothrottle then gradually moved both thrust levers forward to the full power position, but nothing happened.
500.
A short moment later, the radio altimeter's automatic call-out informed the crew that they had passed the altitude of 500 feet. The captain confirmed that the approach was stable by making a corresponding call-out, and the crew received the landing clearance from Heathrow's tower controller.
Speedbird 38, clear line 27 left, wind 210 knots.
The aircraft was now only 30 seconds from touchdown. Still having trouble with the aircraft's thrust, the pilots noticed that both engines were just above idle power, and the airspeed started to drop below the calculated approach speed of 135 knots. The crew moved the thrust levers back and forth several times, but the engines did not respond. Without sufficient airspeed over the wings, the aircraft would no longer be able to produce enough lift to maintain the desired approach path, and the 777 started to slowly descend below the glide slope. Because the first officer had not disengaged the autopilot earlier in the approach, the automation attempted to catch the glide slope again by raising the nose of the aircraft and moving the thrust levers forward. But as the engines were stuck, these commands only caused the airspeed to drop even further, pushing the aircraft closer and closer to entering an aerodynamic stall. At 300 feet, this stall would be unrecoverable. Although the engines did not respond to any input, they continued operating at just above idle power and did not shut down. There was no sound or visible damage that could have explained the sudden behavior to the pilots. So, what could have caused the issue at the most critical stage of the flight? As is the case with many accidents, it was a combination of actions and environmental conditions that led to the events of Flight 38. The Boeing 777 has a total of 3 tanks, one in each wing, as well as the center tank located in the fuselage. By design, the center tank was to be used before fuel could be supplied from the wing tanks. Although the fuel in the center tank was fairly warm after takeoff, as it traveled to the engines via the fuel feed lines routed through the main tanks, it began to gradually cool down to freezing temperatures. The fuel itself did not freeze, but the exposure to this cold weather turned small water droplets within it into ice crystals. The temperature of the fuel during the first few hours fell within what's known as the sticky range, allowing the ice crystals to form a slushy substance that attached to the inner surface of the fuel lines. Although it may seem unusual, jet fuel is known to contain water in very minor concentrations, and due to the low temperatures at high altitudes in which aircraft operate, this water is expected to freeze. Aircraft and engine manufacturers have designed fuel systems with consideration for the presence of ice crystals. For that reason, before fuel is supplied to the engine, it passes through a fuel oil heat exchanger, a vital engine component that routes hot engine oil around cold fuel lines, thus reducing the temperature of the oil and warming up the fuel before it is supplied to the engine. Ice passing through the heat exchanger melts and returns to liquid form, ensuring uninterrupted engine operation. However, because the crew of Flight 38 used the vertical speed mode to change cruise altitudes, the fuel flow within the aircraft's fuel feed lines remained relatively low, and it was not strong enough to push the ice crystals toward the fuel oil heat exchanger. Instead, once the aircraft flew through a region of cold weather, the fuel cooled down further, solidifying the ice that had accumulated inside the fuel lines. It was not until the aircraft began its approach to London that the outside air temperatures increased again, warming up and softening the ice. Once the airliner turned onto the final approach course and established on the ILS, several wind gusts shook the plane around, causing its airspeed to fluctuate. The auto throttle responded to these drops in airspeed with multiple quick adjustments to engine thrust. Combined with a few jolts from light turbulence, the resulting sudden increase in fuel flow broke off the softened chunks of ice inside the fuel lines and sent them toward the engines. Too big to pass through the mesh screens of the fuel oil heat exchangers and still too cold to thaw completely, the ice continued to build up on the faces of the heat exchangers. By the time Flight 38 descended below 1,000 feet, a critical amount had accumulated, almost completely cutting off the fuel supply to the engines. Back in the flight deck, still trying to make the engines respond to the thrust levers, the flight crew received an airspeed low message on the engine indicating and crew alerting system. Programmed to maintain the glide slope, the autopilot continued to raise the nose of the aircraft and the airspeed dropped to 115 knots, 20 knots below the desired approach speed. Coming to a shocking realization that the aircraft was too low, too slow, and still too far from the runway, the captain moved the flaps from the 30-degree position back to 25 degrees. It would cause the aircraft to lose some lift, but moving the flaps up would also reduce drag, allowing the crew to stay in the air longer and increasing their chances of reaching the runway. In a matter of seconds, the 777 lost another 7 knots of airspeed, coming dangerously close to reaching stall speed. As a final warning to the flight crew about the hazardous condition, the aircraft's stick shaker, a mechanical device attached to each pilot's yoke, became active, sending strong vibrations through the control columns. Responding to the stick shaker, First Officer Coward pushed the yoke down, lowering the nose of the 777 and preventing it from losing any more airspeed. Following manual flight control input from the first officer, the autopilot disconnected. The crew had avoided the stall, but they continued to lose altitude at a much higher than normal rate. One thing became clear to the pilots: they were not going to make it to the runway. As the first officer pulled back on the yoke to reduce the descent rate, the captain made a mayday call on the tower radio frequency.
Mayday, mayday, speedbird, 95.
He did not have time to warn the cabin crew and instruct the passengers to take the brace position. Thus, nobody on the other side of the flight deck door realized that they were mere seconds from a crash landing, and shortly after, the aircraft slammed into the ground.
Aircraft accident. The position is the threshold, runway 27 left. Aircraft type is a 777.
Flight 38 made ground contact only 330 meters short of the runway. Upon impacting the ground, its landing gear collapsed, and the right landing gear punctured the fuselage, severely injuring one of the passengers. As the aircraft slid further toward the runway, it veered to the right before coming to a complete stop. Despite the hard impact, the fuselage remained largely intact. Many passengers and crew members received minor injuries, but by a true miracle, everyone on board Flight 38 survived. The story of British Airways Flight 38 shows how quickly a tiny design flaw can turn a routine flight into a life-or-death situation. At the time of the accident, the effects of ice accumulation within aircraft fuel systems were not well understood, and the investigation team spent months recreating multiple scenarios before making a determination that the design of the fuel-oil heat exchangers was the most likely cause. Post-accident calculations showed that Captain Burkle's decision to retract the flaps shortly before the impact resulted in the aircraft traveling some 50 meters further. This seemingly short distance allowed the 777 to overfly the ILS antenna of runway 27 left without contacting it. The damage from such a collision was likely to have been more severe. In November of the same year, while the investigation into this accident was still in progress, a Delta Airlines 777 experienced an uncommanded rollback of an engine while in cruise flight due to the same issue. The flight crew of that flight, however, was able to clear the blockage by setting both engines to idle power as they were at a higher altitude, a luxury that the pilots of Flight 38 did not have. The results of the British Airways accident and the Delta Airlines incident have forced the engine manufacturer Rolls-Royce to review the structure of the fuel-oil heat exchanger, eventually leading to a newer design that was no longer susceptible to this problem. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. You can play it for free right now on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile using the link in the pinned comment or video description. If you're a new player or haven't logged in for at least 6 months on PC or console, you'll also get a massive bonus pack. That includes multiple premium vehicles, 100,000 Silver Lions, 7 days of premium account, and the exclusive Eagle of Valor decorator. It's available for a limited time only, so don't miss out.